This is the third session, Articulation and Acoustics, the third part. I am Mohsen Rezazadeh. I am lecturer at the University of Isfahan. Last session we talked about principal articulators of vocal tract. If you remember, we said that we understand which articulator is making the gesture by these terms: labial, coronal, and dorsal. Later we discussed different places of articulation, namely bilabial, labiodental, dental, alveolar, retroflex, palatoalveolar, alveopalatal, palatal, and also velar, uvular, and glottal. These are all different places of articulation. Today we're going to talk about manner of articulation. First, try to answer this question. Where is the place of articulation for these sounds s, n, and d? Do you remember different places of articulation, like, for example, dental, alveolar, palatal, uvular, velar? Among them, try to find the place of articulation for s, n, and d. Yes, the place of articulation for all these three sounds is alveolar. All of them are alveolars. Now, answer this question. Are they pronounced in the same way? Of course not. This is why we differentiate between s and n and d, because they are not pronounced in the same way. So what is it that we hear different sounds? At places of articulation, articulators may close off, narrow, or modify the vocal tract. This is called manners of articulation. At most places of articulation, there are several basic ways in which articulatory gestures can be accomplished. The articulators may close off, as I said, the vocal tract for an instant or a relatively long period. In another instance, they may also narrow this space considerably. Or, in the third instance, they may simply modify the shape of the tract by approaching each other. According to these three characteristics, closing off, narrowing, and modifying, we have different manners of articulation. First manner of articulation is called stop. Stop, complete closure of the articulators so the air is completely obstructed. When we want to produce some sounds, we have this complete closure of the articulator and the air is obstructed. It is blocked. We have two types of stops. One of them is called oral stop. The other one is called nasal stop. We will talk about them in the following slides. Oral stop or plosives. When the soft palate is raised so the nasal tract is blocked, the air is completely obstructed in the vocal tract. If you look at the image, you can see that the air is completely obstructed in the oral tract. That is, the pressure in the mouth will build up and an oral stop will be formed. When the articulators come apart, the air stream will be released in a small burst of sound. This kind of sound occurs in the consonants in the words like pie, buy, or tie, die, alveolar closure, tie, die, or chi, guy, which is a velar closure. For pi and bi, they were called bilabials, p and b. As you can see, there is an obstruction of the air. This is why we call them stops. And they are oral stops because the soft palate is raised, so the nasal tract is blocked. Whatever you can hear when I say p, b comes out of my mouth, not my nose. Therefore, it is called oral stop. Look at these pictures. Look at the lips in this picture. It is the picture of production of sounds like p and b. As you can see, the lips are closed. Also, this figure shows the position of the vocal organs in the other stop, which was the alveolar stop. Look at the place of the tip of the tongue on the alveolar ridge. It is a closure for t and d. T, d. Try to produce this sound and feel this stop. T, d. This picture is again shows a kind of stop, an oral stop, but it is a velar closure. Try producing sounds like k, k, or g, g. You see the back of the tongue in this picture, k, g, and also you can see that the soft palate is raised and nasal tract is blocked, so you produce oral stops like k and g. Nasal stops or nasals. Look at this picture. As you see, if the air is stopped in the oral cavity, but the soft palate is down, so the air can go out through the nose, the sound produced is a nasal stop. Look at the soft palate and compare it to the previous picture in the previous slide. There, the soft palate was raised, but here the soft palate is down, so the air can go out through the nose. Here we have nasal stops. If sounds like this can be m or s, or for example n, sounds of this kind occur at the beginning of the words like my, which is a bilabial closure, or nigh, which is an alveolar closure. And at the end of this word, sang, g, g, sang, g is a velar closure, sang. You know, this is different from g. G is oral, but here you see ng, sang. See, before g we have ne, and it causes a kind of nasal stop because here again soft palate is down. Look at this figure. This figure shows the position of the vocal organs during the bilabial nasal stop in words like my, me. Look at the lips and also look at the soft palate. Here soft palate is not raised, so the air goes through the nose. And also look at the lips. We have a stop, complete obstruction of air, as in my, me, me. And look at this picture. Again, this picture shows the position of the vocal organs during an alveolar closure, like in n, nigh, n, nigh. And also look at this figure. Here, as you can see, the back of the tongue and also the attachment to the upper surface of the mouth. This is called velar sound. Here we have a velar closure for a sound like ng in sang, ng. So the consonants at the beginnings of the words like day and nigh would be called an alveolar stop and an alveolar nasal respectively. Although the term stop may be defined so that it applies only to the prevention of air escaping through the mouth, it is commonly used to imply a complete stoppage of the airflow through both the nose and the mouth. So we call n and alveolar nasal, and also we call me bilabial nasal. This is how we call these sounds according to place of articulation and manner of articulation. So in sum, me, ne, and ng are nasal stops. Next manner of articulation is called fricative. Close approximation of two articulators so that the airstream is partially obstructed and turbulent airflow is produced. This is a definition of a fricative. The difference between fricative and a stop is that in a stop, the airflow is completely obstructed, but here the airstream is partially obstructed and we have a turbulent airflow. The mechanism involved in making these slightly hissing sounds may be linked to that involved when the wind whistles around the corner, something like this. As you can see here, the airstream is partially obstructed. The consonants in phi or vi, which are labiodentals, or in thigh, which is dental, or psi or zoo, alveolar, and in shy, which is a palato-alveolar, are examples of fricative sounds. All of these were examples of fricative sounds like sh, sounds like z, or th, or v, or f. All of these are examples of fricatives. As you can see in the picture, you can see the pronunciation of fricatives. We have the airflow, which is partially obstructed, as in sh sound. Note that narrowing of the vocal tract between the blade of the tongue and back part of the alveolar ridge causes a kind of sound. The higher pitched sounds with a more obvious hiss, such as those in sigh or shy, are sometimes called sibilants. The consonants with a hissing sound are called consonants, like sigh or shy, although we call them sibilants, but sibilants are kinds of fricatives. Remember that. Approximant. Approximant is a gesture in which one articulator is close to another, but without the vocal tract being narrowed to such an extent that a turbulent airstream is produced. For example, in saying the first sound in yacht, which means a sailboat, yacht. If you pay attention, you can see that the front of the tongue is raised toward the palatal area of the roof of the mouth, but it does not come close enough for a fricative sound to be produced. Look at the picture on the right. This picture shows production of a sound like ye in yacht, ye, ye. Look at the front of the tongue. As you can see, front of the tongue is raised toward the palatal area of the roof of the mouth. But, I'm talking about the right picture, but it does not come close enough for a fricative sound to be produced. Because it is more open, let's say, it is called an approximant. If the tongue is raised more, then that is, if it comes close enough, then we could have a fricative sound. But now we call it approximant. Or the consonants in the word we, we. Again, here we have an approximation between the lips and in the velar region. We, we. And for some people in the word raw, approximation in the alveolar region. These are also examples of approximants. Look at the picture on the left. This is the picture of re. Production of a sound like re, as in rest. In fact, approximants fall between fricatives, which do produce a turbulent airstream, and vowels, which produce no turbulence. In fact, this class of sounds include approximants like, for example, re, as I said, or we, or ye. Some people mention that ye and we are semi-vowels. We will come to that later, but at this stage, what you need to know is that approximants fall somewhere between fricatives and vowels. This is why we call them approximants. Notice how there's not quite contact at the place of articulation. This is what results in the smoothness of airflow. For example, in a sound like ye, 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 you can see that there is no contact at the place of articulation. Or in a sound like re, re. See, this re is different from r. R. For r, you can't have a smooth airflow. That's retroflex, that's something else. But for re, 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 you can see the smoothness of airflow. This is why we call it an approximant. Lateral approximants. Obstruction of the airstream at a point along the center of the oral tract with incomplete closure between one or both sides of the tongue and the roof of the mouth. This is called lateral approximant. Say the word lie and note how the tongue touches near the center of the alveolar ridge. Try lie, l, l, l. Prolong the initial consonant, l, and note how, despite the closure formed by the tongue, air flows out freely. Try it now. If you place your fingers in front of your mouth, then you can feel the airflow. You can feel the airflow. However, there is a closure formed by the tongue. The air flows out freely over the side of the tongue. Because there is no stoppage of the air and not even any kind of fricative noises, these sounds are classified as approximants. As I said, approximants are somewhere between fricatives and vowels. So the consonants in words like lie or laugh are alveolar lateral approximants, but we usually call them alveolar laterals, their approximant status being assumed. When you say lateral, everybody knows that laterals are approximants, so there is no need to say lateral approximant. Look at the picture. In this picture, you can see the place of articulation and also the position of the tongue when you produce a sound like l, l. You can feel tip of the tongue and also airflow from one side or both sides of your tongue. You may be able to find out which side of the tongue is not in contact with the roof of the mouth by holding the constant position while you breathe inward. That is, first produce a sound like L and then do not change anything. Just try to breathe inward. L, L, breathe inward. The tongue will feel colder. Doing this, the tongue will feel colder. On the side that is not in contact with the roof of the mouth, the side which is in contact with the roof of the mouth is not colder. You only feel colder on the side that is not in contact with the roof of the mouth. Try to do it at home, then you can find place of articulation. There are some additional consonantal gestures. One of them is trill, sometimes called roll. Tongue tip trills occur in some forms of Scottish English or in some sounds in Spanish, like for a word like Peru. We also have trill in Farsi when we produce sound like rrr. This is a trill, rrr. Or if you have watched Spanish movies, you can feel that they pronounce re like this. For example, Peru. Yes, these are the ways that they pronounce re in Spanish. Or in Scottish English, words such as rye or raw. These are two words from Scottish English. And the other consonantal gesture is called tap, sometimes called flap. In tap or flap, the tongue makes a single tap against the alveolar ridge. Just a single tap against the alveolar ridge. This occurs in the middle of a word such as pity. Pity in American English. In fact, in many forms of American English, they pronounce this word as pity. Pity. If you pay attention, you can see that there is a single tap against the alveolar ridge. I will show it using an X-ray movie. Look at the tip of the tongue in this clip. I will play it again.
R.
Just look at the tip of the tongue. It's too fast. I'll play it again.
R.
So as you see here, the tongue makes a single tap against the alveolar ridge, and this is why we call it tap or flap. Up to now, we talked about different manners of articulation, but the fact is that the production of some sounds involves more than one of these manners of articulation. For example, say the word like church, and think about how you make the first sound and the last sound, ch, ch. At the beginning, the tongue comes up to make contact with the back part of the alveolar ridge to form a stop closure. Just try to pronounce the word church, but stop. You do something like this without starting it. At this point, it is a stop. This contact is then lowered so that there is a fricative at the same place of articulation. That is, you produce ch, ch, and then you release it. Then ch, something like sh is produced, a fricative. This kind of combination of a stop immediately followed by a fricative is called an affricate. So it is a consonant that begins as a stop and releases as a fricative. And generally, there is no change in place of articulation. Like an example I gave you for a word like church. We have a combination of ch, ch and sh, sh. A stop plus a fricative. Because we have a stop plus a fricative, we call it affricate. So there is a voiceless affricate at the beginning and at the end of the word like church. The corresponding voiced affricate occurs at the beginning and at the end of a word like judge, judge, church, judge. Or at the beginning of a word like cheap, we have voiceless affricate ch. So in all these sounds, the articulators come together for the stop, and then instead of coming fully apart, separate only slightly, so that the fricative is made at approximately the same place of articulation. You can try to feel these movements in your own pronunciation of these words. Next is called glottal stop. Words in English that start with a vowel, like for example arc or arc, these are pronounced with a glottal stop at the beginning of the vowel. In fact, you can't feel it, but there is a glottal catch sound when there is a sequence of two words in which the first word ends with a vowel and the second parts with again a vowel. Here, the glottal stop is obvious. For example, try pronouncing flee east. Flee east. When you pronounce flee, and at the beginning of the second word, which is east, this glottal stop becomes obvious. Listen again. Flee east. This sound is a glottal stop. It is different from a word like fleeced. Fleeced, but flee east. Flee east. Compare it with fleeced. in the flee east, we have a glottal stop at the beginning of east. This is another additional consonantal gesture. Look at this diagram. This diagram shows how the various manners of articulation can be defined in terms of their laterality, nasality, and stricture features. In fact, here I try to define a manner of articulation in terms of laterality, nasality, and stricture. In fact, I try to summarize all of them in this diagram. As you can see, there are two major parts in laterality, central and lateral. Note that there can be no lateral, oral or stop, oral or nasal stops, because lateral requires the air to be directed around the side of the tongue. Stop requires the air to be totally obstructed in the mouth. This is the major difference. So these features are incompatible. So as you can see in this diagram, we have central and lateral in the first part. In the second part, nasality, oral and nasal, both for central and lateral. For central, oral. In the stricture, there are stop, fricative, approximant. In central nasal, again, we have stop, fricative, and approximant. You can see the examples in front of each. For lateral, oral, we have fricative and approximant, but we don't have a stop for the reason I mentioned. And for lateral nasal, again, we have fricative and approximant, but again, no stop, as I mentioned, because stop requires the air to be totally obstructed in the mouth, but lateral requires the air to be directed around the side of the tongue. So in oral and nasal lateral, we don't have a stop, but in oral and nasal central, we have a stop. To summarize, the consonants we have been discussing so far may be described in terms of 5 factors. First, voiced or voiceless state of the vocal folds. Second is place of articulation, as we explained in the second session. Third is central or lateral articulation. Number 4 is oral or nasal sound, when the soft palate is raised to form a V-lick closure or oral sounds, or when the soft palate is lowered to produce nasal sounds. And last one, the one we talked about in this session, is manner of articulation. So we can say that a consonant like s at the beginning of a word like sound is according to the numbers. For the first one, voiceless or voiced, s is voiceless. Number 2, place of articulation, s is alveolar. Number 3, s is central. Number 4, it is oral. And number 5, it is a fricative. On most occasions, it is not necessary to state all of these 5 points unless a specific statement to the contrary is made. Consonants are usually presumed to be central, not lateral, and oral rather than nasal. So points number 3 and 4 may often be left out. So the consonant, like for example s at the beginning of a word like sound, can simply be called a voiceless alveolar fricative. S is a voiceless alveolar fricative. When describing nasals, point 4 has to be specifically mentioned, and point 5 can be left out. So the consonant like ng at the end of a word like sing is simply called a voiced velar nasal. This is all about consonants and the 5 factors of consonants. I think this is the end of the 3rd session. Goodbye.